Welcome back to the tool crib. Today I wanted to show you how I added 240 volt 50 amp service to my garage. It's a project I've been meaning to do for quite a little while and just now getting around to doing it. So the first thing I wanted to do was determine where I wanted my outlet, and I determined I wanted it in line with the 110 outlet that was on this wall. So the reason I drilled the hole there though was because I wanted to make sure that my new box seated against the stud that is just to the left of that outlet. So once I had made that hole and scored over to where I thought the stud was, it actually ended up being a little bit off, but we'll get to that. Then I was able to lay it out and then use a utility knife to score around the marks that I had just made. At that point you can cut the rest of the way through it and get that hole cover out. Now again, I thought I was all the way against the stud, but it ended up I was actually about an 1/8 inch off, and so I had to come back and trim that hole just a little bit over. It wasn't quite as clean as I would have liked it to be installed. I should have paid a little bit more attention there, but all in all it worked pretty well. Now once you have that done, then I was able to go to the attic, and you can see on the right hand side here the cable run that goes down to that 110 outlet. So determining where to drill these holes was pretty easy. Now I elected to use, instead of drilling one large hole for the 8-2 cable that's going to go in there, because I'm using 8 gauge 2-wire cable with the ground, I decided to drill 2 holes side by side and then just kind of connect them to make an oblong hole. Now I don't show it here. I thought because the run was so short that I was going to be able to get the cable down to that new opening without the use of fish tape, but I couldn't quite get there, so I ended up having to go back and use a fish tape. Now luckily for me, on my panel there was already a cable run that was preset for 240 when they built the house. They just never added it to the garage, so I was able to utilize that cable run, and so I didn't have to do any additional work there. Then I came back to the outlet, cut the jacketing off of the cables. Now it's important to note here that I am actually not cutting all the way through this insulation. What I'm doing is I'm scoring around about halfway through the insulation here, and then using a pair of pliers in order to both twist and pull that insulation apart. Once it's scored like that, you can snap it off, and then you're not cutting into the copper. You do not want to scar your copper when you're cutting it like that, because that can cause a fire hazard. So you'll notice here that I got a little ahead of myself and put the plug in before I put the box in. So now I have to go back and take all that back apart. Just need to pay attention, which I wasn't this day. The kids were running around, and I'm just going to use that as an excuse. At any rate, I came back, and I mentioned before I wanted to add a couple of screws against that stud. So I'm drilling out a couple of holes inside of that old work box, and then put the cables through, and then I'm able to seat the box in there. The reason I went with a larger box is because I knew I was going to be doing this. I knew that I wanted to strengthen that outlet box up, because I just didn't trust with a big 50 amp cord. They can be pretty stiff when you're trying to pull them out of their outlets, and I just didn't trust that the drywall was going to be strong enough to hold it over time. So this is just to add extra support. So I tightened up the clips for this old work box, just snugged them enough where it would still slide over, and then I came back in with a couple of panhead screws that would screw that box against the stud and seat it correctly, made a very, very strong connection, and then I tightened the clips on the box the rest of the way down. At that point, now I can reinstall my outlet, which I had I don't know what I was thinking. Important to note here that you have, in 220 or 240, you have 2 hot leads on 2 separate phases, and then you just have a ground lead. So it's really easy. It's 2 hots and a ground. It's pretty hard to mess up, and it makes no difference which side the hot leads go on. You can have them in either orientation. That makes no difference whatsoever, because you're using 2 separate phases. Pretty simple, it really is. Then I was able to get the outlet cover on. Now I went and shut the power off, but I wanted to double check it before I started making the connections in the panel. So again, just like on the outlet, set each of your hot wires into your circuit breaker. Make sure they're snugged down and tightened correctly, and then you're able to snap it into place. And then at that point, I kind of adjusted the wiring in there, make it a little cleaner install. I wanted to make sure that it, just didn't look like it was hacked together. And then brought my ground, or fished my ground around over to the ground lug, and then tightened it in place. And once I had done that, I was able to go back and double check to make sure that I had true 240 at the plug, to make sure everything was installed correctly. And then I'm able to put the panel back on my cover back on my panel. Now this was, because my panel's so long by myself, it was a little tricky to get it in there, but it ended up being all right. And then I went back and I labeled the new circuit breaker as Garage 240 so that there would be no confusion as to what it went to. At that point, I was ready to test out my new outlet, and I got my new little welder here, which I'm going to be reviewing here pretty soon. Really cheap welder, and I wanted to see how well it ran, but it was 42 full load amps on 240, so that's the whole reason I needed to add this on there. And it ended up working pretty good. The outlet works great. Now as far as the welder, only time will tell, but on the first initial run of 240, it actually didn't do too bad. I was a little impressed with it. Once I cleaned it up, it came out looking pretty good. Well, you've been watching the Texas Tool Crib, and this has just been a little instructional video on how you can add 240 to your garage as well. My name is Ben. I appreciate you watching. I'll see you in the next one.